Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to your next video connected to gift. All right, so let me just kind of give you an overview. So what we're going to talk about today is your spiritual gift, right? So in case you're not aware, right, in case you have not done any other training with me or listened to any of my videos on Facebook, there are 7 spiritual gifts. Now, usually when I'm teaching about spiritual gifts, especially when people are in kind of my longer term programs, I go into deep dives, right? But the goal here in your purpose program is to give you enough for you to have a really good understanding, because we're not going to focus on gifts the entire time you're in the program, right? Step 1 is really understanding your gift, right? And so because we're not going to focus on gift the entire time, I do not want to spend 2 hours on this video, right? My promise to you was to do 20 to 30-minute videos that are kind of easily digestible, followed with a little bit of homework, okay? So this video will be max 30 minutes. And what we're going to do in this video is really just talk about what are spiritual gifts. Like, we're going to go through all 7 of them in a very succinct and clear way. Again, I usually teach for much longer periods of time, so we'll see how well everything gets covered. But of course, you know, you can jump onto the calls and ask any questions that you have. All right, so step 1, in case you have not done it, is you need to know what your spiritual gift is in order for you to get any kind of value out of this training. Okay, so most people who are taking this course have already taken our assessment, but in case you have not, this is going to be critical for you in order for you to get anything out of this training. So if you have not taken the assessment, push pause, right, and come back to me, right? The way you access that assessment is either by going to LaChelleBarnett.com or by texting the word gift to 574-319-1373. Again, it's 574-319-1373, okay? And if you text that word, it'll prompt you to take the assessment. It's pretty quick. It's going to take about 10 minutes or so. Ask you a bunch of questions. At the end, it'll give you a report. It'll tell you what your gift is, right? In that report, it's going to tell you some of the positives, some of the negatives. It'll go over a little bit of the information that we're going to go over today. But in this training, I want to give you all 7 of the gifts, because here's the thing. While we all have a primary gift, and some of us have kind of a dual primary gift depending on how you score, we are gifted in all 7 areas, right? So I don't want you to miss that. Just because we have one gift that is the strongest for each of us, the truth is we're gifted in all areas. It just so happens that my strongest gift might be leadership, or my strongest gift might be giving, right? So it's important for us to have a kind of a context if we're going to really find out what our purpose is and live our life to the fullest, okay? All right, so let's jump in, okay? Again, push pause if you haven't taken it, because you need to know that. So the first thing that I want you to kind of know is that everything that we do here has a spiritual backing, right? Has a spiritual undertone, because I'm super spiritual and I believe that that's how it's supposed to go, okay? So I do not claim to be a Bible scholar. Look at my face. I'm not a Bible scholar, okay? But I do my best to, number one, find a backing in the Bible to what I do professionally, but then also just to be a student, right? A teacher, not a teacher, a student of the word, right? So I do read the Bible, and I am always kind of learning and kind of doing deep dives, but I want to be clear that I'm not a pastor, nor do I have that level of spiritual wisdom when it comes to the word. But I'm always growing, because I'm always learning, okay? And I'm intentional about reading my word. So I say that because I want you to have the spiritual scriptures that go in context with spiritual gifts. So you can go to it now, you cannot go to it now, but I want you to at least write it down. So it's Romans 12, okay? And the place that you're going to find the specific spiritual gifts that we're going to talk about today is Romans 12, 6-8, okay? Now, I would encourage you to read all of Romans 12, right? Start with verse 1 and read through 5, even though it does not specifically talk about gifts, because context is important, right? Sometimes we take things out of context because we don't even know the context. So as we're learning about spiritual gifts, I want you to understand that in Romans chapter 12, this is Paul talking to the Christians in Rome, right? He is, there's a lot of things happening in that time period, a lot of chaos, a lot of what I'm going to call backsliding. And so he is saying and doing things to kind of get people back on track. Okay. So I'm not going to read all of that to you, but I want you to have the spiritual reference to say, okay, these gifts are actually biblical. Okay. So that's Romans 6 through, well, it's actually Romans 12, right? The whole chapter. But Romans 12, 6 through 8 is where you're going to find all of the gifts that I'm listing, right? But read the whole chapter. All right. So let's jump into the 7 spiritual gifts. So let me run them down for you, okay? So the first one is prophecy, right? So that can also be called the gift, the perceiver, right? So in the next video, I talk a little bit about how there are multiple types of gifts, right? And, excuse me, in an attempt to not make this any more confusing than it could be, I want you to at least understand that what we're talking about when we talk about spiritual gifts is motivation, right? We're talking about the motivating gifts. These are the gifts that you actually possess, right? And these are the gifts that make up a lot of your personality, okay? All right, so the first gift is prophecy or the perceiver. Sometimes people call it the perceiver just to keep it out of the Christian or spiritual realm when we start talking about prophecy, right? But they're the same, the gift of the perceiver or prophecy. The second one is teacher, right? The gift of teaching. The third is leadership or administration. Sometimes people use administration versus leadership, same thing, right? The gift of service, the gift of giving, the gift of mercy, which can sometimes be called the gift of compassion, right? We'll talk about the difference between the two, but they are interchangeable. Well, you may hear someone interchange them is probably a better way to say it. So don't get that confused that the gift of mercy and the gift of compassion can be the same. And then the last one is the exhorter. Okay, so we're going to go over all of those, and I'm going to do well to manage my time here. All right, so let's first start talking about the gift of prophecy. Okay, so the gift of prophecy is very unique in that this is kind of typically the person who, number one, speaks truth at all times and wants you to know the truth, bases everything that they do off of truth, right? Now, depending on the person that has this gift determines what their truth is. So, for example, truth could be biblically based, right? So I know some people who have the gift of perceiver or the gift of prophecy, and because they're Christians, their truth is all biblical, right? So you're not going to hear them talk about nothing but the word of God, right? These are not typically the people who like to have casual conversations or just kind of shoot the breeze type. Nah, these are people who are going to want to stick to the facts and be very truth-based or truth-oriented. These are also the kind of people who you are either going to love or hate, right? Because one of the things that's unique about the gift of prophecy or the perceiver is that they don't always have tact in their communication, right? So they have great communication skills. They tend to have the gift of speaking, right? Because they proclaim the truth, but they don't always have the compassion that should accompany truth, right? They're really just mostly focused on you knowing the truth. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of these. And let me just say that as I share some of the positive attributes and the negative attributes of all of the gifts, you will not have all of them, right? You will not have all of the positive. You will not have all of the negative, right? And I'm only going to share some just for the sake of time, because the truth is there could be, anywhere from 20 to 30 different positive and negatives just connected to each of the gifts. But what I did was I tried to pull the ones that were very similar, so that way you can get a really good picture of who you are, number one, the gift that you have, and some of the other gifts. Because again, remember that we have all of these gifts, right? We don't just have one. It just so happens that we have one more than others. And if you're taking, or if you have taken my gift course, then you know what your secondary and third and fourth and fifth gift is and how you scored. Because sometimes we score very similar numbers and they're very tight, so we really have two gifts. Sometimes the numbers are really far away and we're really only gifted primarily in one area, but that's a whole nother conversation, okay? I just want you to know that you are not going to have every single characteristic that I list, okay? So if you have the gift of prophecy, here are some things that are kind of positive characteristics or positive traits connected to this gift. All right. So you tend to speak about truth at all times, right? We mentioned that. You tend to base your answers on truth. So whether it's book knowledge, the word of God, you tend to be opinionated, but when you speak, there is heavily, that's not the word that I'm looking for. It is geared mostly towards facts. Okay. People who have the gift of prophecy tend to have higher degrees of faith than other people, right? They tend to walk more by faith and less by sight. Okay. They also are not easily swayed by the opinions of others, so they don't really succumb to peer pressure. And mostly it's because they are based on facts, right? So if you are basing all of your information and your moves on facts, well, then why would you be easily swayed? Okay. There are also people who are willing to suffer for what they believe, right? So we sometimes call them martyrs, right? But people who have the gift of prophecy tend to lean that way. They tend to have a thirst for knowledge, and they also tend to not be hypocritical, okay? So those are all the positives. Well, not all. But let me give you some of the negatives. And again, one of the things that I want you to be able to pull out as you're listening to these is where, number one, the gift that I got, is it true for me, right? Very rarely do we have people who are like, I don't really agree with that. I think I've actually never had that happen so far. But I also want you to listen to some of the negative characteristics. So the positive, more about confirmation. Yep, that really is me. And the negative are really showing you where you need to cultivate and grow, right? Again, in the next video, we talk about cultivation a little bit more. But all of these gifts, just because you have a gift of leadership or prophecy or giving or whatever, does not mean that you don't have to grow. Because the truth is, we're called to master, right? Not just to have money, but be able to master money, to be able to, not just to be a parent, but to be the best parent, right? So mastery requires cultivation. So you listen to the negatives specifically, so that way you can look at your areas of weaknesses and places where you need to grow. All right, so some of the negative attributes of the gift of prophecy or the perceiver. I already told you that they tend to lack compassion, right? They tend to lack tact, right? So when I say tact, their ability to communicate in a way that kind of conveys compassion, right? They tend to be blunt and straightforward. They're always sincere, right? Which seems like a positive, but sometimes they're sincerely wrong. Right? Like that's the tricky part, is that because they're so logic-based or fact or truth-based, sometimes they can be sincerely wrong in what they're saying. And you're going to have a difficult time convincing them of that, okay? They're very difficult to correct if they're wrong because they can't typically see that. Sometimes they can suffer from self-righteousness. Basically, when I say self-righteousness, I'm talking about seeing kind of the rights and wrongs of things, looking more outward than inward. So not really looking at themselves, right? Looking at why this person's wrong and that person is right and that person, but not necessarily doing the same evaluation for themselves. They also tend to kind of lack a sense of humor. Not that they don't have a sense of humor at all, but they tend to be much more serious kinds of people. Okay, so that was the gift of prophecy or the gift of the perceiver. Right, now let's start talking about the teacher. Okay, so the teacher, this is the person who really wants you to learn something, right? Go figure, teaching, learning. And they're very actually similar to the gift of prophecy in a couple of different ways. So both tend to be great communicators, right? Teachers tend to be great communicators. Teachers tend to want to stick to the subject, right? They don't typically like to go off and have casual conversations about, things similar to the gift of prophecy. They tend to be persuasive because they are great communicators, and they also tend to be avid learners, right? Similar to the gift of prophecy. Where they tend to differ, right, is they tend to be more innovative, right? Because they are always looking to teach. They tend to have a little bit more innovative kind of thinking. They tend to be well prepared and sometimes over prepared, right? So the gift of prophecy, they tend to be a bit more spontaneous because they have a lot of confidence, right? Like they have confidence in what they're saying, and therefore they can kind of be a bit more spontaneous. They can just kind of rattle off, whereas the teacher needs to be a bit more prepared, right? They feel kind of more of an obligation to have an organized fashion to what they're teaching, okay? So let me list some of the positive and negative attributes of teachers so you can get a feel for this particular gift. Okay, so I already mentioned some things: great communication, well prepared, innovative, persuasive, all of those kind of things. They're very willing to conform to their teachings, so they tend to not be hypocrites, right? They tend to want the things that they teach to line up with their own life, right? I already talked about, really having a desire. No, I don't know if I said that. So they also have a very strong desire for knowledge, right? As a teacher, you're always wanting to learn. They also tend to be very teachable, right? They want to sit up under mentors and kind of learn different things because they are looking for knowledge. They tend to be very courageous, okay? Very committed, mentally tough, right? So let me give you some of the negatives for the teacher, okay? So some of the negatives is they tend to over communicate, right? Sometimes they are just pouring out information because they have so much information that they've learned from within. So they tend to over communicate. Sometimes they can overemphasize self, right? Maybe when they're giving examples in their teaching, they can use the word I frequently, which could be a negative. They tend to be extremely opinionated simply because they have all of this information that they've learned, and so they feel kind of like a know-it-all, right? They can be argumentative for that same reason because they're very opinionated. And one of the things that I have found as I've learned about these giftings is that teachers tend to stay with the negative too long, okay? And what I mean by that is because they want you to learn something so bad, they tend to stick around a little bit longer than what they should, okay? They have really such a positive desire to see they have such a desire to see a positive outcome or a positive result that they're willing to keep trying and keep trying, okay? So that is the gift of the teacher, okay? I really want you all to be listening and not so much about your primary gifting, because you should know that one, right? But for other things that may be your secondary one, right? So again, if you take the gift course, then you will have access to all of, number one, all of the information that I'm sharing here in written form, but then also all of your giftings. Okay, so the third one is leadership or administration, okay? So the thing that's interesting about leadership or the gift of leadership is that I would say of all the gifts that there are, the gift of leadership is the one that has to be cultivated the most, right? Remember that all gifts have to be cultivated, and all cultivated really means is you have to work on them in order to really be a master, right? So sometimes people think that, oh, I have the gift of leadership, or I have the gift of prophecy or whatever, and so I'm already a master. No. Let me be clear that just because you have the gift of something, all that means is that God has given you more of something than he has given someone else, right? So my natural gifting, right? So I'll use myself as an example. I have two primary gifts, okay? And my primary gifts are leadership and teaching, okay? And all that means is that on my worst day, I'm going to be a better teacher or a better leader than parts of the world. Okay, let's just say 50%, which is not an accurate number. I'm just using that as an example. Okay, so 50% of the world, I could get up and do nothing. Okay, and I would be a better leader and a better teacher than 50% of the population, because that is my natural gifting. But here's the thing: in order for me to be, number one, the best version of myself, which is the goal here, right? The goal is to be able to really use your gift as much as possible to be able to glorify God and others, right? To be able to fulfill your purpose, to be able to operate in a way that aligns with who you are, which creates the maximum amount of happiness. Well, you can't really do that if you're going to be mediocre in your gift, okay? So the other 50% of the population that actually has cultivated their gift of leadership and their gift of teaching is going to far out excel, even though that's your gift. Why? Because you're not working at it, right? You're not working to improve the areas that need to be improved, right? Just because I have the gift of leadership does not automatically make me a great leader. It just makes me a better leader than somebody else. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. All right, so the reason why the gift of leadership has to be cultivated more than some of the other gifts is because this is the gift that tends to have, for lack of a better word, more of a secular background, right? So when I say secular, I just mean worldly or non-Christian, okay? So many leaders have spent an, I don't want to say extensive time, but a fair amount of time and have had a lot of experiences that would be not Christian or not godly, right? Because leaders tend to be the ones that have both the worldly experience as well as both the spiritual experience. And the reason for that is because leaders have to be relatable, right? Like leaders have to be people who have gone through some things in order for you to relate to the people that are going to be following you. So keep that in mind, that while that is one of the things that comes with being a leader, you also have to be mindful that that can be a negative. It's a necessary evil, right? There's nothing you can do about it. You need to accept it. But you also have to pay attention to how do all of these experiences shape me as a leader, okay? And you have to really work at cultivating and improving the areas that could be weaknesses for you. Okay, so let me give you some of the positive and negative characteristics of leaders, okay? So some of the positives, okay? They tend to be mentally tough, right? They tend to be very committed to their cause, whatever causes they are of interest in, okay? Of interest to. They tend to be self-motivated. They don't tend to need a lot of external motivation, okay? The other thing is that they tend to be really good communicators, similar to the gift of prophecy, and the gift of teaching is also a speaking gift. Let me make sure I'm getting where I'm supposed to be. They also tend to have the ability to motivate others. They tend to have the ability to inspire others, simply because they have that gift of communication. They also tend to have good confidence and the ability to prioritize and organize and be able to set goals, right? All of the things that you kind of think about when you think about leadership. All right, so here are some of the negative characteristics that come with leadership as well. So the first one is pride, right? So sometimes because they have a high visibility and things really heavily depend on them, they tend to take things a little bit more personally. All right, so they also tend to be impatient, right? They don't really like slowness. I can attest to that, as that is my primary gifting. Sometimes they can tend to be the center of attention instead of Jesus, right? Because you're gifted in this way and because you have such high visibility at times, sometimes the focus can get kind of out of balance. They are prone to be workaholics. I plead the fifth. Kind of hate to admit that they can't handle a particular thing because they tend to be pretty confident. They tend to make poor followers, right? Which is, well, I'll just leave that alone. But they tend to be poor followers just because they think that they kind of can do it better, right? Sometimes they can have a difficult time accepting criticism because of the pride factor. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, okay? I just want to give you kind of the basics of each gift. So far we've done prophecy, teaching, and leadership, okay? So keep an eye out for the ones that you think that is your kind of secondary gift. All right, so the fourth one is the gift of service, okay? So the gift of service really is kind of how it sounds, right? It's your desire to fill a need. I'm going to go over some of the things that are positive and negative characteristics of this gift as well. So the gift of service really wants you to see something, right? They really want you to see the love of God. They want you to be able to see the works of God, okay? So some of the positives of the gift of service. So they tend to be very compassionate people, right? They tend to not be lazy, right? So if you're going to serve, you tend to not be lazy. They also tend to be the kind of people where they're both the janitor and the CEO, or the teacher and the babysitter, or because they tend to have this attitude or this philosophy, there's no job too big, too small, too dirty, too nothing, right? Like they're willing to kind of give whatever is needed when you have this gift of service. They are typically quick to respond to a physical need. They tend to be very dependable, and they tend to not need as much recognition, right? They tend to be people who are just kind of willing to serve without being noticed, okay? So then some of the negative characteristics of service. So number one, they tend to not be able to say no very well, right? Which would make sense if you are kind of such a person who likes to serve. So no can be difficult for them. They tend to take on more work than what they should, just because they see so many needs around them. They tend to become irritated with other people when they aren't willing to help fill that need, okay? They're really apt to help when they shouldn't, right? So sometimes we need to feel the consequences of our actions. And when you have this gift of service and you just kind of want to fill the need, sometimes you give when you shouldn't, or you help when you shouldn't. Sometimes they tend to overlook their own needs, and they sometimes tend to overlook the needs of those closest to them simply because they're so focused on servicing others, okay? So that is the gift of service, okay? So then let's talk about the gift of giving, right? Which is connected to the gift of service, but they're slightly different, right? So the gift of giving is really more about wanting you to have something, right? Have something of substance. Whereas the gift of service is really more about really being able to serve you, right? So the gift of giving, you can give anything, right? Could be your time, your talent, your treasure, anything that you have, okay? And so here's the thing that is interesting about those who are who have the gift of giving, okay? So these tend to be people who are kind of upset, angry, frustrated, simply because they don't know how to utilize their gift, right? Because they tend to be giving and giving and giving, and other people don't treat them in the same regard, right? Other people tend to be takers, or they tend to not treat them the way they want to be treated. There can be resentment and anger, particularly with this group of people, okay? And if you're a giver, I'm sure that you have probably felt that more than one time, and may even be kind of a normal feeling for you. So let me give you some of the positives and negatives connected to the gift of giving. All right, so some of the positives are they're sensitive to the needs of others, right? That makes sense. They tend to respond to the needs of others, sometimes in secret, but they tend to respond to needs. They also tend to give cheerfully or out of joy, like they enjoy doing it, and freely, right? And I think it's also important to mention that when you have the gift of giving, it's not just about monetary things, right? You could be a philanthropist, right? The person who gives millions of dollars to people in charities, but you can also be the person who doesn't have a lot of money, but gives of their time and their resources and their energy and all kinds of stuff. So don't cross yourself out just because you're not at the top of the food chain monetarily. And really, the thing that kind of sets people apart as a giver is the fact that typically givers always have something to give, right? which is interesting, especially when you're on the lower end of the totem pole economically. But you always find yourself being able to give, despite the fact that you don't always, or other people kind of, well, how do you have money and I don't? And so something to kind of think about. Here are some of the negative characteristics connected to the gift of giving. Let me get my papers together because I'm spreading out a little bit too much here. Okay, so the negatives. Sometimes they can interfere with God's plan, right? Again, we talked about the fact that sometimes we need to feel our consequences of our actions, right? Sometimes God is trying to teach people something, but because you're a giver, you're enabling, right? So that might be the word that we use. So when you enable somebody, you don't really allow them to feel the consequences of their actions. You're really helping them so that way they don't hurt or they don't feel pain. Some of the other negative characteristics are they tend to be unselfish to a fault, right? That's where kind of some of that anger and resentment comes in, because if you're unselfish, but other people are selfish, well, then there's kind of an incongruency. So there's a need to figure out how to operate within your gift. They tend to respond too quickly, right? The same kind of thing where sometimes people really need to be able to feel their consequences of their actions. They have very little patience with people who are stingy, right? They feel kind of guilty for not giving, right? So those are some of the negatives that come with the gift of giving. All right. So we've done 5, right? So we've done prophecy, teacher, leadership, service, giving. All right. So then let's talk about the gift of mercy. All right, so one of the things that I want to pull out about the gift of mercy, number one, sometimes people call it the gift of compassion, right? They use this interchangeably. And let me tell you the difference between compassion and mercy. So compassion is basically the feeling, like the pity that you feel when someone is sad or when they're suffering, and it's your desire to help, okay? That's compassion. Mercy is basically how you treat that same person when they're in the midst of their suffering, right? So it's kind of like compassion moved to action is mercy, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So people who have the gift of mercy are kind of going to be tied to the person who has the gift of giving, right? So if you have the gift of giving, your secondary gift might be mercy, or vice versa. If your primary gift is mercy, then you have a good chance of having giving as your secondary gift. All right, so some of the positives connected to the gift of mercy / compassion. So number one, you tend to be compassionate, right? That's a no-brainer. You tend to be a person of intercession, right? So intercession is just prayer, right? So you tend to pray and declare and kind of have positive words for those people who you know are suffering. You also tend to be forgiving if you have the gift of mercy or compassion. And again, I don't want you all to confuse the fact that you have to have all of these, right? And it doesn't mean that you do them 100% of the time. It just means that you tend to lean this way versus the other. So they tend to be very giving of themselves, right? Not just of their, money or items, but also giving of their time and themselves. They tend to show kind of a, what do I want to call it? What's another word for compassion? I'm trying to think here. So basically, they have kind of the strength, the patience, the ability to give and give and give, in spite of some of the other things that are happening around them in their own life. Okay. Here's the other thing that I think that's important with this particular gift of mercy is, let me make sure I'm getting this. Yeah. Is that you have to be able to keep your relationship with God in good shape. So that way you can be, for lack of a better word, monitored. So that way you don't go too far off course, right? Like if you have this gift of mercy and you want to be compassionate and have grace for people, you have to be pretty careful to be guided by God so you know when to stay and when not to stay. Okay. So that is the gift of mercy. Okay. Oh, those are the positives. I didn't give you the negatives. So let me give you some of the negatives connected to mercy. So one is that if you do not have a close relationship with God and you do not spend time there, you have the ability to have mismanaged relationships because of the amount of mercy and compassion that you have. I have so many notes and so many things to share that I want to just make sure that I get them right. So I want to make sure that I give you the negatives for mercy. So here's what I want you to really think about. Thus far, I've given you 6 of the 7, okay? And I want you to really think about, which of these sounds like my secondary gift, okay? Which of these really sounds like I'm kind of bent that way, right? I see myself in this this secondary gift, okay? Because that's really the purpose of this. You already know your first gift. You already have the download, the report that tells you the positive and the negatives. So now really it's about being able to figure out that second step, right, to the best of your ability without, having your results, unless you've already taken the course. And then, of course, you know them already. But it's also about really filling in the details, because sometimes people get the results and they're like, well, I don't know if this is really me or if it's not me. So I just really want you to kind of backtrack. And if you're taking notes, either taking notes or rewind and watch it again so you can kind of hear some of the positive and negatives, okay? So here are some of the negatives for the person who has the gift of compassion or mercy. So this person tends to be indecisive, okay? They struggle to make concrete decisions. They also tend to kind of take up for other people too quickly, or people who you should not be taking up for at all. They sometimes can be easily hurt by others. They can also empathize too much with people who are suffering, right? Maybe one other thing that we might consider to be a negative for people who have the gift of compassion or mercy is sometimes they tend to be pretty affectionate people, right? And that affection can be misinterpreted, right? Can be misinterpreted sometimes in sexual ways. Okay. All right, last one. The last one is the gift of the exhorter, right? So the gift of the exhorter is kind of what it sounds like. It is the encourager, the motivator, right? This is the person who wants you to continue something, continue believing, continue doing whatever it is that you feel like your purpose or you're called to do, okay? So some of the positive characteristics of the person who has the gift of exhortation, right? So one is that they tend to be pretty loyal. Okay, they tend to be pretty dependable. Of course, they tend to be pretty positive at all times. Not always, right? This is not about 100%, but this is the person who tends to see the glass as half full. They tend to be pretty easy to love because they are so easygoing, so to speak. People tend to value their opinions, right? So people may come to you for advice if you have this particular gift. And they tend to express themselves pretty well, right? Some of the negative characteristics of the exhorter, they tend to be stubborn, right? Because they really want to make everything work. Sometimes they can be resistant and somewhat stubborn. They also allow negative people to lean on them too long, right? When you're an encourager or a motivator, you really have to kind of watch your own energy. So be mindful of that. Sometimes they speak before they've gotten all the facts. So they're encouraging and motivating about things that they don't necessarily know as much about as they should. Sometimes, kind of similar to the previous one I just mentioned, is that they have so much anxiety in terms of in their desire to encourage, and it may not just be, when we talk about anxiety could be like this physical reaction. So I'm going to use the word anxiety loosely, okay? But they have such a desire and such an anxiety to encourage that sometimes they encourage too soon, or they motivate too soon, because again, sometimes people kind of need to feel the consequences of their actions. And so they're kind of out of balance in that way, or they can be out of balance in that way. So those are some of the negatives for the person who is the exhorter. So I hope you got some good information from this video. If you need to listen to it again, listen to it again. Make sure you're looking at Romans 12, really the whole chapter, but specifically 6 through 8, and watch your next video. As you learn things, don't forget to use our hashtag and post on social media. You don't have to tag me or anything like that, but just as you're learning new things and as you're having aha moments and as you're being encouraged, I'm looking forward to kind of seeing the hashtag at the end of the program and other things that you've learned. So go ahead and move to your next video that goes a little bit more in depth in how to really operate inside of your giftings.